Introduction. Knowledge is power only when you know how to absorb it, and that is exactly what Foundations of Indian Psychology, Volume 2 teaches. We will focus on what it says about psychology and consciousness. Stay with me, the best part is near the end. Overall summary. Psychotherapy and Integral Yoga Psychology. Michael Miovic 6. A psychology-friendly meta-theoretical framework. The first major contribution the Indian civilization can make to psychology is a psychology-friendly meta-theoretical framework. Whether in his study of matter or of the human personality? What was the psychological understanding of the nature of man? As is the man, so is his path of growth and action in life. Life itself is a yoga, a process of growth and transcendence of the psychological being of man. Chapter 1: Psychology and Consciousness. We use the word Indian to indicate and honor the origin of this approach to psychology, the origin of the underlying philosophy, the conceptual framework, the methods of inquiry, and the technology of consciousness that it uses to bring about psychological change and transformation. We hold that Indian psychology as a meta-theory and as an extensive body of related theories and practices has something essential and unique to contribute to the global civilization as a whole. This volume has contributions that demonstrate how ideas and practices from the Indian tradition can be used to tackle issues in contemporary psychology and constructively inform its disciplinary practice by helping theory building and application. Psychology as taught at present, all over the world, is still amazingly unicultural. For it is not that the rest of the world has not thought about human nature, and it is not that contemporary psychology has found the one and only correct way of doing so. What the Indian civilization can contribute to psychology, the unique contribution which the Indian civilization can make to modern psychology, can be looked at as consisting of three distinct elements: a sophisticated and well-worked-out, psychology-based meta-theoretical framework, a wide repertoire of psychological practices, and a rich treasury of psychological theories. In fact, the idea of a single truth supporting a variety of manifestations is itself one of the core characteristics of the deep view of reality that underlies the whole wide gamut of Indian traditions. Western psychology is largely confined to two dimensions which are both fully accessible to the ordinary waking consciousness: the physical and the social. Genetics, neurophysiology, and the cognitive sciences are typical for subdisciplines with a focus on the physical dimension, and the various offshoots of psychoanalysis, social constructivism, and cross-cultural psychology could be considered typical for those who focus on social factors. Between the two, there is still, in spite of many attempts at softening psychology, a widespread tendency to take the physical dimension more seriously than the social. Even within the field of consciousness studies, the existence of physical reality tends to be taken for granted, while the ontological reality of consciousness and subjective experience is open for discussion. Related to this, in epistemology, the ordinary waking consciousness is considered the only acceptable state for the researcher to be in, and a clear rational mind is taken as the ultimate arbiter of truth. The intellectual tradition of India starts from radically different assumptions. Ontologically, the most fundamental reality is not matter, but spirit, or more precisely, the indivisible unity of Sac-Chit-Nanda, of absolute existence, consciousness, and delight. The Indian tradition includes psychological phenomena like consciousness and joy as core elements of reality, and in fact it takes not physics, but knowledge of the self, aditya vidi, as the fundamental science. These non-physical realities are considered to be intermediate planes of conscious existence between the absolute, silent consciousness of the transcendent and the apparent unconsciousness of matter. Finally, objective, sense-based knowledge is considered a minor form of knowledge, or even ignorance, avidity, and an immense collective effort has gone into the development of processes that can make us more open to the subtle worlds, and especially to the pre-existing inner knowledge, vidhi. It may be clear that these two basic views of reality lead to a different sense of what psychology is about, how it is to be conducted, and what can be expected from it. It is taken for granted that consciousness, whether individually or socially determined, depends on working neural systems. For those under the influence of the Indian system, consciousness is primary. The borders of the individual are porous, and the individual consciousness is found to extend through space and time, to others, to all kinds of inner worlds, and even to what is beyond all manifestation. For research in Indian psychology, sophisticated first-person methods are the natural first choice. In application, Indian psychology aims primarily at the mastery and transformation of oneself. Chapter 2: Psychology and Consciousness. In the culture of origin, however, they are part of a coherent knowledge system and they are looked at as a way to arrive at reliable knowledge. The good news then is that modern scientific and ancient Indian approaches to psychology may not be so much contradictory as complementary. The methods of yoga should be understood on their own terms, and ideally not only in their gross effectiveness but in the underlying spiritual and psychological processes. They worked instead through a focused, specialized application of in itself simple psychological processes and powers. Indian psychology has dealt with most areas in which mainstream psychology is interested, and in many of them it has something unique to add. But besides this egoic center, which belongs to the ordinary waking consciousness, the Indian tradition has also developed a detailed nomenclature for many other, more subtle and non-egoic centers of consciousness, and it has even worked out, especially in certain Buddhist schools, how a consciousness can exist without any center whatsoever. Similarly, the Indian tradition has found below the surface of our waking consciousness not only the dark unconscious that depth psychology has explored, but a whole range of subtle chaos or layers of consciousness, that each have their own characteristic nature. The study, cultivation, and perfection of these subtle, not sense-based forms of cognition, might well deserve to become one of the major thrust areas of Indian psychology, as their development may lead to the creation of appropriate research methodologies for a whole new field of psychology. Another major area of interest in psychology is that of emotion and motivation. Suffering is attributed to ego-bound deformations and limitations of the over-individualized human consciousness. Psychology is much an applied science, and fields like pedagogy, education, social work, human resource development, organizational behavior, and therapy can all be looked at as specialized fields of applied psychology. But in Indian psychology, which is built on self-knowledge than on knowledge of statistically generalized others, the demand for self-work, for understanding and mastering one's own self, goes further both in breadth and in depth. The practical application of Indian psychology differs from present-day mainstream psychology in a manner that parallels the differences we found in the various areas of theory formation. But Indian psychology as a branch of modern science is a new field, which is as yet in its infancy. The first volume clarifies the basic theories and concepts of Indian psychology, and its first section deals with the social and philosophical context. It delineates what Indian psychology is, and then, in the second chapter, describes how the academic science of psychology developed in modern India. The last two chapters of this section offer two different perspectives on the postmodern methodological and social global environment in which Indian psychology is presently rediscovering itself. The other three sections of this first volume deal with the same major issues that modern, mainstream psychology deals with. The first is on self and personality, the second on research methods and cognition, the third on emotion, volition, and motivation. But there is one big difference. As we have indicated at the beginning of this introduction, Indian psychology is rooted in a consciousness-based, spiritual, yet secular and life-affirming tradition, and each chapter of these three sections tries in its own way to see what spirituality and a consciousness-based understanding of reality can contribute to our modern understanding of the human mind and its possibilities for further development. The second volume, Practical Applications, shows the deep and wholesome changes that the use of Indian psychology can make in the applied fields of health and healing, education and society. The basic theoretical and methodological foundations of Indian psychology are sound, and they have a tremendous potential to enhance the quality and wholesomeness of psychological research and practice. Not only for the study of natural phenomena, where the success was all too evident, but this was also the method to be applied to the study of psychological and social phenomena to man and society. There was no reversal of this perspective of psychology in the West. Chapter 3, Consciousness and Knowledge. Parallel to this development in the perspective of psychology, the physicist, in applying the analytic and reductionist method to the study of matter, arrives at radical results, which reverse all previous findings. He set out to disengage parts, so as to study them in their distinctiveness and thus arrive at a knowledge of the sum of the parts, in the form of aggregates, thus creating a structure and interlinking of the parts within the whole, with the whole present in each of the parts. A new departure in the further quest for knowledge is inevitable. A sense of a vast web of the collective, as primary reality, prevails. An integrative cycle of knowledge and cultures is ours. What is the perspective in which the Indian spirit has sought knowledge of man, nature, and the universe? The Indian spirit was imbued, since times immemorial, with a sense of three great intuitions. Consciousness is the one all-pervasive fact of existence. All that is consciousness. Consciousness self-possessed or cast in forms of its own substance, to make real to itself its outline of objectivity. An inalienable absoluteness of joy, the joy of consciousness creating endlessly forms from its own substance. All experience and knowledge flow from identification with this pervasive fact of conscious existence. The way of knowing that is by a secret identity with it in the immediacy of one's consciousness. And since all existence is one and consciousness is the all-pervasive reality of this existence, man has only to fathom in himself the secrets of this consciousness and thus unravel the secrets of all existence. Thus the entire process of knowledge is a unitary fact, and the way of knowing is to energize the consciousness force in oneself and to become identified with the all-existent, so as to gain knowledge of its contents in their full range and extent. The method of the natural sciences, the analytic, reductionist one, has not had such a long history of practice. Thus the entire quest for experience, lived in consciousness, and the resultant knowledge arrived at, of both content and form, have been pursued in a psychological perspective. A perspective of sounding the depths and ranges of consciousness in oneself and in the universe. What he is, what he holds secret within him as further possibility of growth in qualitatively higher levels of consciousness, and how he can attain to them. In the light of these findings and the discovery of the truths of such psychological dynamics, it looked at all the structures of life and society. Be they of education and culture and human relationships, or the many sciences and arts of life, or the structures of economy, polity, and governance. Implicit in the creation of these structures was the deep psychological perception that growth to qualitatively higher levels of being was an innate fact of man's existence, both for an individual and for society. There are 5 KOAs, or sheaths, in the psychological being of man. Chapter 4, Life and Consciousness. The Pramaya, the life sheath, the vital energy, the Manomaya, the mental sheath, the mind. Each of these sheaths has, within itself, a range of levels in the quality and action of that formation of energy from the lesser to the greater, the less conscious to the more conscious. The mind itself, though characteristic of the human mold, is only one level of consciousness, and there is an entire gradation of levels superior to it in quality, action, and range of possibility. The status of being an individual enjoys the adhikrabhita, which is his by right, is determined by the quality of consciousness and its range in the total gradation that forms the basis of the personality. Such status is innate and self-existent, it is solely a fact of consciousness. Among the structures of collective life, which are built into the social existence of an individual, and which offer him the steps of a ladder for his own growth of consciousness, are the var as the four types of actions which the society needs, and which are part of the individual's own law of growth, and are necessarily present in his own existence. There is the Brahman, the seeker after knowledge, who also imparts it to others. The Vaya, who creates and produces so that life can continue its exchange of means and to fulfill her needs. The human body itself from the head to the feet is symbolic of the functions that meet the needs of life. The Ramas, the four stages of an individual's journey through life. 4. Life is an evolving and enriching process, and the psychological needs and the seeking for fulfillment changes with its progression. Knowledge of the sciences and the arts, practice of martial skills, bodybuilding, character formation. The period of the householder's life, of making one's place in society, of drinking deep at life's many founts, of marriage and children. But the fundamental psychological perspective in which the ancient Indian placed himself was that of the innate urge of man to transcend himself, to exceed his existing status of consciousness, and to reach out to whatever lay ahead of him as a further possibility. Having discovered the secret of the dynamics of the operations of consciousness and having sounded the possibility for each part and element of the psychological being of man to go beyond its existing range or limit to a greater one, the ancients in India set out to discover and experiment with a set of processes that were psychophysical. These processes could take up either each of these parts in itself or all the parts together in the person taken as a whole, and see if the fact of change and transcendence could not be made a conscious process, pursued deliberately and by a willed effort at practice, through a sustained endeavor. Thus were created the various yogic disciplines, each one often specializing in taking up one significant part of the human personality and entering deep into its complex functioning, recombining its elements and opening them up to the action of forces of a higher order to effectuate changes in its own functioning. Such are the disciplines of Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and many others. As a complex entity of many essential psychological elements or parts, and discover and experiment with processes that could take up the entire complexity of this psychological structuring and make an attempt to raise the whole to a higher level of being and functioning. We wish to observe here that this entire effort at the deepest level of exploration into the human psyche, the creation of psychological disciplines on that basis and their continued practice through unrecorded time, is a fact of the utmost significance in human history and for the future possibilities of man. The knowledge born of the practice of these ancient yogic disciplines and the modern ones could well be of inestimable value in creating a new future for man himself. It is equally significant to note that the Indian psyche has, speaking, a deep and abiding attraction towards the pursuit of yoga, whichever discipline may be taken up by an individual. Not only as a specialized pursuit to which one's life is dedicated, but all of life in its many aspects, and all the structures that have been created offer a pathway of growth for man's consciousness. This becomes evident if we carefully observe these structures which form the basis of the life of the collective, and the underlying truths which give body to this culture. Chapter 5: Consciousness and Whole. The process of integral yoga has a bearing not only on the individual in the entire range of his personality, but this range includes the presence of the collective as a psychological force and reality. At the present moment, it is a self-exceeding of the mental consciousness of man of mind in its habitual operations that marks our onward advance. He experiences it as the level in the scale of evolutionary progression where all dichotomies cease and a consciousness of the whole with its power of whole willing, whole feeling and whole action become accessible to him in one movement of his being. A level of consciousness, a supreme grade in the ascension of man in which the all-pervasive spirit reveals its secrets in matter. Matter made of the spirit's stuff, an essential whole recreating itself in the parts. A veritable transformation of matter is the aim that the process of integral yoga offers to man. Is the method and process of integral yoga what contemporary man is looking for as a means to transcend the mode of action innate to mind and to attain that of the supramental level of consciousness? This knowledge is by identity, which can work directly with the contents of consciousness. And since consciousness is the all-pervasive fact of existence, it can eventually work directly with all existence, even with all the forms of matter. But, academically, he is nurtured on the perspectives of psychology that have taken shape in the Western world. He needs to free himself by a deep and wide psychological action of perspectives ingrained in him by such education. And to see if these perspectives are complementary or can be integrated into a greater whole of both knowledge and method. His innate capacity to sound the depths of the experience of consciousness that India has made is his to avail of. As a result, health occupies a central place in the contemporary global social agenda. The sources of trouble in health, tapas, or those of diseases, both physical and psychological, vidi and di, may be located in physiological, daihika, supernatural, daivika, and physical, bhautika, factors. The state of health and well-being is contingent upon the orchestration of the physical, mental, social, and spiritual aspects of our being. The joint activity and correlation of time/season, sensory modalities, and action can lead to a state of health. Understanding the reality of this world requires searching within and extending the boundaries of the self. Human life is meant for expressing the divine bliss inherent in us. We need a positive approach to discover joy and happiness in life. The Indian view considers a person as consisting of a gross physical body, sthula deha, a soul, jva, and a self, tman. Modern sensibility confines itself to the gross body. The body, sense organs, manas, mind, and buddhi, intellect, exist for the self, but the self exists for itself and there is no reality beyond it. Closing. That is the heart of Foundations of Indian Psychology, Volume 2. If it helped, a quick subscribe keeps more summaries coming. So how do psychology and consciousness connect? That is exactly where we started. Go back to the top and watch it click into place.